Are any of these specs going to become stronger? Are any of the specs going to become weaker? That is the question about 10.0.7 and the balance tuning that will come with the patch. We had our video grouping together all of the content coming in 10.0.7 except for the balance tuning planned for 10.0.7. So in this video we are going to take a look at all of the changes planned for 10.0.7 and trying to see how many changes, how many important additions or how many important nerfs are going to come the way of different specs to see if they might change their situation right now. So let's take a look at all of the changes planned for 10.0.7, starting alphabetically with Blood Death Knight, and Blood Death Knight is at 0. There are literally no additions, no modifications whatsoever for Blood Death Knight. The only changes go the way of Frost and of Unholy. Unholy is in the few changes tier, perhaps even the barely modified tier, because the few changes going Unholy's way are to talents that they were not really taking before. There aren't really even any significant talent tree changes, you know, things swapped around, talents added, talents removed, etc, etc. Is only a handful of underused talents being buffed. Things like Pestilent Pustules or things like Defile or things like Raptured Viscera. So overall, not really any significant changes to Unholy. The strength of Unholy right now is gonna more or less remain the same after 10.0.7. Who is going to be a little bit better is Frost Death Knight, who gets actually powerful additions to things they already use, buffs to obliteration, buffs to their killing machine procs, buffs to their damage and to their runic power spending, to the changes to Breath of Sindragosa and to Frost Strike. So overall, unlike Unholy, Frost actually gets some decent changes, and from the situation Frost is in now to the situation after 10.0.7, Frost will be improved. So they will be receiving proper changes in this patch. At the very least though, both of these specs did get some changes, something that we can't really say about Demon Hunter, because both Havoc and Vengeance reduce very, very few changes, in fact barely any. Both of them. It's not that surprising for Havoc, which was doing already fine right now. It's definitely more surprising for Vengeance, which is not a tank spec doing too well right now. So if you were thinking about rolling Vengeance Demon Hunter for 10.0.7, they are not really gonna get any major or even small changes in the next patch, so their power level is basically going to stay the same as what it is right now. The few amount of changes continue to go the way of Druid, with very few changes going the way of 3 out of 4 specs. I'm talking about Balance, Feral and Guardian Druid. Balance Druid is effectively receiving 0 changes, Guardian Druid is arguably actually getting nerfed with something we talked about already, and Feral Druid is getting a very minor change, moving away some of the damage away from their cooldown Berserk and giving them some more damage increase to some of their abilities, Shred, Swipe, Brutal Slash and Thrash. So overall, very, very few changes to these 3 specs. However, Restoration Druid gets a few more changes. Nothing major, okay, nothing groundbreaking for the spec, plus Restoration Druid is already doing well right now, so it's getting a few changes. It's not actually getting nerfed per se. You could say it is getting nerfed because now, due to, as you can read here, many of the changes in locations of talents, the last bracket of the talent tree for Restoration Druid is a little bit worse than the last bracket of the talent trees that Restoration Druid have right now. So that's only the minor change that Restoration Druid is going to receive in 10.0.7. Few changes, and I would mark it down to be a slight nerf honestly, given how the new talent tree is going to work. Now, however, if you can argue whether or not the 1 to Restoration Druid is a nerf, what we cannot argue is the nerf to Preservation Evoker. There are some minor changes to the general tree of Evoker and barely any changes to Devastation Evoker. Who, however, gets major changes is Preservation. And I know, it looks weird to call them major changes. As you can see here, it's just like 2-3 lines of text. It's not much, but the amount of nerfs are significant. We already mentioned them in the video about these nerfs. So these are meta-defining changes, despite being so few, because they might, it's not guaranteed, but they might make Preservation Evoker quite much worse than the place it is in right now. It might amount to nothing, of course, especially because these nerfs are not actually hitting Mythic Plus Evoker that much. They are more about hurting Raid Evoker, much more, but it could have a significant effect. Certainly more of an effect than all of the changes to the specs we have seen so far. Talking about changes, we have yet another round of changes we have mentioned recently. These are some fresh changes. The compensation buffs to Hunters after the nerfs to Neltharax, the Razageth bow for Hunters. These are going to be proper changes. I don't think they are going to be meta-defining, mostly because after the bow, the buffs are going to amount to be somewhere in between a 2 to a 6% damage increase between AoE and single target for the specs. Nothing like massive, but still a worthwhile set of changes for the class. That's it though. Just the compensation changes. No stuff about talents, no stuff about adding talents, removing talents, changing the talent tree of the specs, just about some damage increase to the abilities because the Hunter bow is getting nerfed. That's basically it. And also, this is mostly just about the 2 Hunter specs with a bow, not the actual Hunter spec using a spear survival, which gets very few changes. Talking about very few changes, we have also more or less absolutely 0 changes to Brewmaster Monk in the Monk category, as well as very few changes to Windwalker Monk, which gets a few buffs to their single target damage. At least they have some changes, unlike Brewmaster, which gets 0. The one who is going to get more changes is Mistweaver Monk. So yet more changes, and these are going to be buffs, more or less just buffs for Mistweaver. Definitely more, and we continue to have more Mistweaver buffs. This is like the 4th, 5th or 6th round of buffs in a row planned for Mistweaver Monk so far in this season. We have yet to see, honestly, the results of all of these buffs for Mistweaver, because it's not that they have been that much better. We will see after 10.0.7, after yet another round of buffs to the spec, if it's going to change for the positive for them. Okay, fine, now we have the wall of text. Wall of text is actually an understatement. I am 100% sure, even without going back every single expansion to check, that this is the longest ever wall of text in patch notes for a single class. It's unbelievably long for the Paladin. We have talked about this multiple times. All 3 of these specs are significant meta-defining changes, even just for their general talent tree, without even having to touch the specific spec tree. Holy Paladin and Protection Paladin do get some quite significant changes in their general Paladin tree, and then of course Retribution Paladin might as well be an entire new spec to play with in 10.0.7. That's gonna be the highlight of 10.0.7, especially if you are a melee. If you were looking at playing a new melee spec, then of course the obvious answer is to try out the new Red Paladin. Besides that, I just mentioned it's a record about the length of the changes to Paladin. It might also be a record about the few amount of changes to Priest in a set of patch notes. We are generally used to see a whole bunch of wall of text for Priest instead. Now we have basically 0 changes to Discipline and 0 changes to Shadow Priest. we could say Shadow Priest has been buffed already enough times. Shadow Priest has gotten now to S tier within the ranged camp, so it's not that they needed that many more changes, as well as Discipline perhaps is the more surprising one, because Discipline does need perhaps a little bit more help, even though Discipline also has been changed quite a lot recently. The only one that gets buffed a little bit more and receives a few more changes is Holy Priest. The more significant changes for Holy Priest are the significant buffs to Lightwell. Blizzard is pissed off that players continue to ignore this talent, so they are just outright buffing it significantly. That is more or less the highlight of the changes for Holy Priest, which is still very, very little. It's not gonna amount to much in terms of changes to the spec. We go back instead to amounting to a little bit more when it comes to changes to the spec, because we are talking about Shaman. Now, Shaman doesn't have too much by itself for Elemental and Enhancement. Their spec trees are not changed that much. Most of the changes for Elemental and for Enhancement will be in all of these talent changes in the general tree. Swapping talents around, changing rows, modifying some of them, buffing a few of them. So those are the few changes going the way of Enhancement and Elemental. Who receives instead proper changes, proper buffs for the spec is Restoration Shaman, which gets quite a few improvements to the talent tree, the specific Resto talent tree, as well as a whole bunch of buffs, increasing the pathing of the talents by quite a lot. We also talked about this, about how the last bracket of talents for Resto Shaman is getting much better in 10.0.7 to before. So that's where I would like to put Resto Shaman, around proper changes / meta defining. I want to be positive for once and say that overall the changes are meta defining. It might end up not being nearly as important, but at least there is the chance that all of these positive changes will improve even more the state of Resto Shaman, which, by the way, already has been buffed by quite a bit recently. In the last few rounds of hotfixes, Resto Shaman already benefited quite a bit by multiple rounds of buffs to the spec. Lastly, out of the specs receiving changes, we have Warlock. So the one who receives the least easily is Destruction, because most of the changes to Destructions are only tied to the general tree. So the spec tree of Destro doesn't really get anything. The spec trees are only being changed for Demo and for Affliction. Both of these specs are receiving proper modifications to their talent trees, none of which are going to end up being meta-defining. They're not like massive changes, but they are, wide. They are spanning multiple talents, multiple abilities, multiple buffs, both of them worth mentioning. They are getting both buffed, the specs, Affliction and Demo. So there is the case for being a little bit more positive, a little bit more hopeful for these two specs in 10.0.7. Nothing major, as I said, but, given the state both Affliction and Demo are right now, you are taking more or less everything that can be a buff to these two specs. Of course, also weird how Destro, which is perhaps in an even worse situation than these two specs, is actually receiving 0 changes. That's perhaps something weird by itself, but we don't know the dark ways of Blizzard as to why Destruction hasn't really been modified. Now, talking about not knowing about the dark ways of Blizzard, you might notice from this list of changed specs that we are missing, actually, 3 whole classes. Yeah, it's not that difficult, honestly, which of the classes missing. The classes missing are Rogue, Mage, and Warrior. These are specs we haven't even talked about at all because they are not receiving any change whatsoever. I would say understandable and not even that surprising for Warrior and for Rogue. Because Prot Warrior is an S tier tank spec, you have Fury Warrior and Arms Warrior, which are between the A-ish tier specs for Mythic Plus and for raiding, in particular Arms Warrior, as well as Rogue. Rogue has been towards the S tier of all sorts of content for months now, and it makes sense not to touch the classes. What makes perhaps a little bit less sense, and what also is a little bit more surprising, given how very often players, including myself, accuse Blizzard of being biased towards mages and buffing them very often, in this patch we actually get no attention to mages whatsoever. And it's not that mage right now is doing that well either. Any of the 3 specs is perhaps a first in the history of WoW, where we don't really have a one meta S tier spec for mage. I would say perhaps that is the most surprising thing about this 10.0.7 when it comes to changing the specs, the fact that mage is going to receive basically no attention. So, with this recap being done, we can see that roughly half of the specs in 10.0.7 are actually not going to receive changes. Then we have a decent split when it comes to the amount of changes, going higher and higher towards the few meta-defining specs, being more or less the full rework to the Paladin General 3 as well as the Spec 3 of Red Paladin, and the good amount of buffs to Resto Shaman, and at the same time the heavy amount of nerfs to Preservation Evoker. That seems to be the highlight in terms of balance tuning that we will have in 10.0.7. Now, maybe we have just a few more changes left for 10.0.7 in terms of tuning, so this list might change before the patch is actually released, but this is where we are right now in terms of changes for the specs to the patch. So, in case you wanted to take a look at which specs to play, what you could have been interested in for the patch, these are the amount of changes, the importance of the changes going the way of the specs in the next patch. So, as we wait, we are stopping the video. In the meantime, we are starting the goodbyes, of course, at the end of the video by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel. You can, however, as always, support completely for free. Liking and commenting down below and subscribing to the channel itself are fine enough ways to show your support without spending any cash. You can also support in similar free ways, following me over on Twitter as well as following me over on my stream at Twitch. Over at these links are good enough ways as well. After all of these social unpleasantries being done, we are going to leave each other. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, my drive to finish editing this video is because I have to go eat and I am hungry.